Hello and welcome to the Otakus After Dark, the podcast by adult weebs for adult weebs. Grab your drink of choice and sit back and relax as we talk about shipping culture and the morality of Lolis on today's podcast. I'm Dom Hoozle, and I'm joined here with Exile Sentinel, aka Danielle,
Hello.
and the ever wonderful Emily.
Hi, and I love that introduction. Thank you.
No problem. I figure I'll do that before we get into this. Listener discretion is advised for this episode as we will be discussing sensitive topics of a sexual nature, so please be advised of that. So let's get in, before we get into anything big, let's get into shipping culture. Danielle, you had a definition for that.
Yeah, so what is shipping? Well, shipping is originally derived from the word relationship, and it is the desire by fans for two or more people, either real life people or fictional characters, in our case, fictional characters, to be in a relationship. Ships can take many forms and have different characteristics. They can be heterosexual, homosexual, polyamorous, asexual, platonic, and even between characters of different ages. So ships can be canon or fanon. Canon means the relationship is already established within the material it came from, whereas fanon means it is not a part of the original story. Shipping often takes the form of creative works, including fan fiction, fan art, and as we all know, it lives and breathes on the internet. It's a fast way for it to travel the world. So us here at the podcast like to try to give ourselves questions to talk about for the topic that we are on. So our question regarding creating ships and pairings is there an issue with creating ships/pairings in a series that are non-canon, being male-male relationships, female-female relationships, questionable age gaps? You know, what are the pros and cons of shipping culture in the anime and manga community? And I guess we can start by kind of touching on each of the different types of ships. A big ship in the community, especially nowadays, I feel like it is growing even more, is the same sex kind of ship, where it's yaoi and yuri, or in the days of early fan fiction, slash, as they would call it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fun fact, that came from Star Trek, actually. The slash comes from the pairing name of Captain Kirk and Spock, so it'd be Kirk/Spock, which kind of is how slash came about, which is kind of interesting.
Now it's more
Wow, I didn't know
that
that.
character X that character, at least in the otaku community. So
generally speaking, the X or the plus sign would be towards heterosexual ships.
I didn't realize there was a distinction. That's interesting.
Yeah, I've never seen a distinction. I've definitely seen a lot of more yaoi shippings, but that might just be because I'm a guy and I see I see the boys love shippers a lot more, and going on to the fact that I like a lot of romance and shoujo, being a guy, I see more women sexualizing male characters together. I think a perfect example of kind of a series that takes that and tongue-in-cheek is Kiss Him Not Me, where she wants to pair all the guys together and not with herself.
Sorry, I had coughed off mic. But yeah.
I disconnected. I was like, hello?
No, sorry. I choked on my water.
It's alright, I'll cut it all out.
But yeah, that's definitely a good example of like an in-text ship. I know there's definitely people on the internet that will ship male characters in their shonen that are, not meant to be together. I know we talk about it a lot, but take Naruto, for example. The Naruto ex-Sasuke shippers, whereas it is canon that he is with Hinata.
Yeah, but
Yeah, it happens a lot.
I feel like Naruto though leaned into it with they had them kiss like what the original season or whatever, even by accident. But essentially, I mean, the mangaka knew what he was doing. He knew what he was starting. he wasn't he wasn't trying to be tongue in cheek about that. He was pretty upfront.
I mean, I don't actually necessarily think that's a bad idea on his part because it really gets like the fandom involved, I think, when like shipping takes place in literally every fandom, like everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So him leaning into it is probably a smart idea because it creates that like um it creates that community that's gonna write other stories and create art about it and do all sorts of things that are gonna draw other people in, possibly. So
So when does that?
I
Sorry, but like
I was
when?
just gonna say
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I partially agree with that, Emily. The only thing I have a problem with that is the idea of possible queer baiting, whereas, someone who, say, is a young boy who is also into other boys sees that and it thinks that's where that's going, could send kind of a wrong message in that, whereas it could be seen as trying to pull in that audience, but then they don't deliver on that in the end, which could be a bit problematic in itself. But it's
see
always
what you're
hard.
saying.
It's not. I
Um,
don't think it would be fully intentional, but it could be a possible issue.
That's
I
interesting
can
because I
see
didn't
that
think
being
about that.
an issue, and neither did I actually. I do understand what you're saying. The only reason that I wouldn't see it as I see it as slightly problematic, but I don't necessarily see it um as a huge issue, and the only reason is because I think that it really depends how much you step over the line with it. Because I think by slightly making them like close friends where you could possibly get the like you can create a ship out of it, right? People do that all the time. But I also don't see a problem with a young gay kid looking at that and saying, okay, so it is a possibility. It could be more normalized. Especially in shonen where it really like you don't see gay relationships
Mm-hmm.
very
Yeah, and
much
I'm not
in
saying that
shonen.
Naruto, his his creator, necessarily was doing that. That was just the example. But
Hmm.
I do
Right.
think there could be that possible chance of it happening. You know, in a form of media that could be problematic to bring in somebody to, try to give them a space. Um, but then basically down the line, have the creator come back and say, "Oh, that'll never happen," or "Oh, that's never my
Hmm.
intention," you know?
Absolutely. I think, and I definitely think that that speaks to just something that should be addressed in shonen more is maybe making more gay characters, like or just making characters of different sexual orientations in general, and making it more a more diverse genre possibly. Um, but I think that I wouldn't necessarily see it as too much of a negative thing. I mean, if they're at least dipping their toes in it a little bit, then I guess that's better than nothing. Because again, I do think it's an isolating genre in that way. Like they don't tend to represent anything but like the heteronormative stance, I guess.
I think a big thing with shonen is like they have their format, so they're not going
Mhm.
to accept anything that's too far reached from that. I would love to see more of either same sex pairings or bisexual pairings in shonen
Mhm.
series and stuff like that. I think it would make it, you know, stand out above the rest for sure. Uh, but I don't see it as a plausible thing. At least not within like the next 5 to 10 years. Um,
It definitely, I do think it's a shame because I think that the target audience for shonen, I don't think would be very into it, and I think that that's why it's not as much of a thing, and why it doesn't really exist. And I guess that's probably why the gay ships even happen in the first place, is because it's an underserved community in shonen, so they have to create it for themselves.
I think also
I
like
think is how they get a bad rap as shippers,
mhm.
They get those 100% shonen gun ho fans that are like, no, 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 you can't ship this person with this person. That's not canon. That's never gonna happen. They're not like that. Whereas, someone just wants to live out their fantasy without like, you know, creating a piece of art and creating a fanfic that's not gonna hurt anybody. Like you don't have to go out of your way to read it or look at it.
I think
Oh,
also like
absolutely.
um there's just a difference in culture as well that influences this kind of like development in these series. So like Japan is a lot less, I think, accepting um seeing it from an outsider perspective than us over in the West. I think
Mhm.
that we're more open about sexuality as well as same sex couples and the LGBTQ community rather than Japan, who, even if you read like series that are kind of openly boys love or girls love, a lot of like series that I've picked up that I've seen the girls love, it's not a genre that I usually pick up. I'll pick it up if it seems interesting enough. Um, but what from what I see, perhaps I'm wrong about this, but what I see is more of, even though you know what this series is going to be about, it's a yuri or it's a yaoi or whatever, there's a little bit of tiptoeing around the subject, and even when the characters like do things with the same sex, it's seen as like a taboo. So
I
I don't see
Yeah, I agree with that
yeah, I don't
for
see
sure.
shonen uh very much taking that step forward. I would say I would be more interested in the yuri and yaoi genres taking more of that step forward firsthand, and then hopefully branching out more.
All right. So then, off that topic, because there are more ships to talk about, another big type of ship would be the love-hate kind of relationship between characters, which would be romances between two characters, who canonically hate each other. It is often interpreted that these characters share a sexual tension, which, you know,
So like
I've
tsunderes.
seen, yeah,
Hmm.
or like, to put it, not that like Midori like hates Bakugo, but you know how like there's that antagonization from Bakugo towards him. And then there's a lot of people that ship the two together, um, which we've talked
Yeah.
about before, how there are facets of the My Hero community that can be seen as toxic, which I've had some people say, like, the shipping side of that can be toxic.
Yeah, so that's actually as soon as you mentioned the love hate thing, that's actually the first ship that I thought of, that I've seen. And to be honest, like as somebody who kind of loves the people that hate each other and they go from hating each other to like lovers, like that kind of trope, I I could see myself enjoying like a ship of that nature, um, or like any like villain and like the good guy, like that kind of thing. But I I don't know. I don't have a problem with the ship inherently. I think it's more fascinating than anything because it's like something that I just don't see, particularly between Deku and Bakugo. It's like I just don't see that, and it's kind of funny to me. It's kind of amusing, but yeah, I don't really have a problem with like the lovers, the haters to lovers kind of thing. I don't have a problem with that.
I don't
Um,
I don't inherently hate it either. I think it's more of like going back to like elementary school where it's like, oh, you fight because you like each other and stuff like that, and kind of being coy about it, and trying to hide your real feelings rather than being an adult and being more open about your feelings. But my inherent issue with it is when it's like the characters are quite clearly should act more mature, and it drives me nuts because it's just like, come on now, be woman up or man up and just say how you feel. But
Right.
I don't find anything bad about that kind of manner. It just, I don't know, gets annoying after a while.
What I will say to add on to that, because we did end up asking people to like tell us what they thought, some of our listeners and like viewers and stuff, to tell us what they thought about ships and like how they feel. And somebody actually did mention that one of the toxic things about fandoms is when somebody doesn't agree with your ship and then you kind of lash out at them. And I think that that can be a problem, particularly within this type of shipping, because when two people are clear enemies and somebody tries to tell the person that's shipping that, they refuse to accept it. They refuse to believe anything otherwise. And I think that's when it can turn a little bit toxic and negative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I I definitely think the toxic side of shipping, uh, really these people have developed an unhealthy connection to their ship, and to them, their ship is like law. It is it is like their way of life. And if somebody says anything like bad or like puts it down in any way, they are on the immediate attack mode, you know?
Yes, absolutely. Like the main problem is I think just that internalization of the relationship, and it's like they can't separate their own visualization of what they want the art to be and what it actually is. And so it ends up kind of ruining their enjoyment of what the artist has created because it's not what they are starting to envision it as.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of negative.
And I think you see a
Definitely.
lot of that toxicity with a lot of shonen type um, manga. Not to say that
Ships.
the yeah, like not to say that those are the only ones that happen, but the big ones you notice are usually the shonen ones because they're more out there and more exposed. So like, for example, you had the ships with Naruto and Sasuke. You also had Naruto and Sakura. And then you had, the Sakura going against Naruto and Hinata, and that was a big thing until the end, where the author was like, "No, no, no, it's Naruto and Hinata. It's never been anything different." And I mean, if you watch or read the series, you'll see that it's like quite clearly being led that way. Um, Whereas Naruto never really had a chance with Sakura, but the the issue becomes those devoted fans that are like, no, Naruto likes Sakura, so they should end up together and all that, and they're in the same team, and they just like the character so much more, that it ends up becoming toxic behavior.
Yeah, I think, and like this is where we start to kind of talk into darker themes, that there are bad ships out there that can like not necessarily glorify, but like they definitely put it on a pedestal because it is their ship. But there are ships that are toxic that condone like pedophilic themes, abusive themes, even like incestuous themes that
Mm-hmm.
are definitely not written into the story. But somewhere along the line, someone has thought this person and this person should be together, even though like they have this huge age gap or they are mentally on different levels, like Hisoka and Gon in Hunter x Hunter.
Yeah,
Like Gon is a
Yeah.
child.
and if you want to talk
He is
about
a child.
incestual, I know that I've never personally read or watched Demon Slayer, besides like a handful of clips and stuff like that. But I know for a fact
Hmm.
that the community, there's a large portion of people who push um, I guess, I don't know what she is. Is she a cousin or younger sister? And
Sister.
yeah, and him together. It for me, that's a little weird, but It's fiction, so I'm not too bothered by that. It's when people get weird, really hardcore about it, and then that becomes a little bit of an issue because it pushes people like me away from the series. I don't want to be a part of that kind of drama, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that the problem with it for me is that it's romanticizing very problematic behavior that
Mhm.
occurs in real life and is actually very traumatic and horrible for people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's making it seem like it's acceptable and kind of making it normalized for a lot of people. And I definitely am hesitant to support ships like with extremely large age gaps involving children or like yeah, brother and sister family relationships. Like it's very strange to me. Uh,
Yeah. Well, so as an artist, um, I take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt more than I think others would. Um, just because I am very much for, the freedom for the artist to express oneself. Um, the issue is making sure that that line is drawn between reality and artistic creativity. And I think you see a lot of issues with, we talked about the series Act Age, where Act Age was a, on the surface, it's just like any other age gap series like Living Room. Uh, is it Matsunugi-san? Um,
Matsunaga.
Matsunaga. Um, like it's kind of the same, preference where it's an age gap, an older guy and a high school female. But once you realize that it's more of, that was almost, a play by play of what the mangaka was actually doing in real life, and that becomes his more pedophilic diary of sorts, then there's an issue where there's no separation, and that was his fantasies, and that is what he was doing, um, and I think that becomes a serious issue.
right. And I that's what I am concerned about is where's the ship coming from? And is it coming from a, a place of kind of an evil place or like a creepy place? Like, why are you shipping uh, like people with familiar relationships or like
Yeah, like what is your
with
mental
large age
state
gaps?
on
Yeah,
those topics?
it concerns me because I think that a lot of the time, not always, but a lot of the time, it's coming from some sort of inner desire or some dream that you're like trying to reenact or like put out there in some way.
And it's this isn't a new issue, so this is a big issue with the art community as a whole. um, so I actually talked about this in classes that I took when I was in college, where artists like Gauguin, Van Gogh, um, Picasso, they were drawing these nude women, and they were underage females. Especially, I think Gauguin went over to, I think it was like Tahiti or something, and he would um, pay these poor underage girls to pose in um, his paintings nude and all of that. And quite clearly, you can see even in the faces he kind of paints, um, he paints them as being very uncomfortable, and and it's very, you can't prove anything 100%, but there's a big thing that's like he was most likely having sexual relations with these underage girls as well, and paying them in cheap ways, just because they were poor and they needed the materials or whatever. But this isn't a new thing, and um, it's very much, should we separate the artwork from the artist, and have that separation of reality and art, or should we say no, this is that person's public fantasies that they're essentially putting out there, and should we take it, get rid of it entirely? I know that's a bigger topic than we want to grasp at this moment, but it's just something, food for thought.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. And probably this would be a good time to talk about the lolicon community,
Yeah.
and that kind of artwork, and how it relates to exactly what we're talking about.
I definitely had nicer things to say about ships, but okay.
Well, we could talk about that.
Yeah, well, go
before
ahead.
diving
Go
in.
ahead.
I think that's a lot better than diving into this harder topic.
Yeah, so I definitely don't want to leave it on a bad note because I do think shipping isn't inherently bad.
No.
I definitely think like any like community or something, they're just like those bad seeds that take it too far.
Yeah.
I do want to read a couple people's takes on the subject though, because I also put out a tweet and got some anonymous feedback because I don't want to put anybody's business out there. I do have one friend who kind of wrote me a TED Talk, so I tried to analyze and put together their thoughts into a cohesive storyboard here.
Awesome.
So they started out by saying that the internet culture, when we first started using the internet versus now, is a very different place, and it only makes sense that shipping culture has evolved with it. They note that shipping right now has been split into anti and pro. Anti meaning anti-pedophilia, anti-incest, anti-everything bad. And pro is just ship what you want. This person noticed that a lot of their arguments are basically boiled down to, does fiction affect reality? And anti say fiction does affect reality. Example, like how groomers use lolicon, fan art, and media to groom minors into normalizing it. Whereas pro shippers say that fiction does not equate to reality and that they are mature enough to know enough that fiction is separate from reality. Anon also said that they used to be a hardcore anti, but now they wouldn't call themselves a pro shipper either, mainly because there are some things that shouldn't be normalized. But they believe shipping culture has gotten so ridiculous. And as a direct quote, they stated, "We have antis who freaked out over a 4-year age gap in 2 adult characters because when character A was 18 and character B was 14, that's pedophilia." And they said, like, no, if the character meets as adults, it's fucking fine. So they're characters.
Yeah.
End quote. Then they go on to talk about pro shippers who, in a direct quote from them, I'm like, yeah, I live your life. Live your life. It's bold to be a freak on Maine, lol, end quote. But to the anon, it boils down to if you tag and label your shit accordingly so people who get triggered by certain topics can avoid it. They believe it's fine then, and they note how people make 18 plus not safe for work accounts so that they don't expose minors who follow them on Maine to porn, and yet some antis deliberately seek them out to make call-outs. Even though people make these 18 plus spaces and add warnings and tags to filter accordingly. They finally went on to say that shipping and fandom is fun if you're just having fun with your friends in your own little bubble, because it feels like people rehash the same Discord every week. They do point out that it's annoying that shipping culture has evolved into purity culture because, quote, God forbid a relationship not be healthy or an ideal or have an age gap bigger than 1 year. Liking a ship that isn't ooh woo hold hands and blush doesn't mean you support abuse, end quote. We both agreed that relationships in real life aren't perfect, and you can't expect people to always want a perfect ship. But as long as you're not hurting yourself or harassing others, you should be free to ship as you please.
Wow.
Interesting.
It's a lot
Yeah.
to
And
unpack.
it's a lot to
It was a
unpack.
lot to
It's
take.
a lot.
Yeah.
I would say that I agree with some of it, and obviously we kind of did discuss a little bit about problematic shipping. So I can't say that I completely agree, but I do think that there is a line, and people need to know when maybe it's going too far. But generally, I'm supportive of ships as well. I think it's a fun way to get involved in a community or in a show or in a book, anything like that.
Yeah, and the general consensus after that is pretty much like someone said, I don't mind it. That's to a certain point, though. Once we have kids and older people involved, I'm out, which goes back to the problematic age gap, which can lead into more darker topics.
Yeah. So
Um,
I think it's definitely like the topics that we have today are definitely gray area topics where there is no completely right or wrong answer. And I think I agree with some of the points, like Emily was saying. I agree with some of the points that the person's saying. And at other times, I don't necessarily agree, which is fine. Everybody has a difference of opinion. But I think definitely everything's a case by case basis, and there's a huge difference between separating and enjoying a series because you have separated that, and then also having a separation of, so not only having a separation of audience but also having a separation of the mangaka as well. So like for example, not just talking on shipping, but you know, you would separate a horror manga from the mangaka secretly wanting to be a serial killer or something, or they've gone out and done that. So you'd want to separate there. So definitely separating on these different shippings that the mangaka has made with the age difference or ancestral and stuff like that. And perhaps that's not exactly what they are interested in, but more so from an artistic standpoint, they think that it's a interesting topic to cover, if that makes sense.
it's interesting you brought up that like specific example of like being like a serial killer, but not really,
Yeah.
because the same person that I just read that excerpt from said one of their friends actually had written a fan fiction with two characters in like an alternate universe 80s slasher, and they were literally attacked on the internet because people were like, "Oh, well, you're perpetuating like violence and serial killers and blah 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 blah," and like
Yeah,
basically made them totally afraid to like express themselves after that. Like they are still like emotionally scarred from that.
it's the same thing that happens with like any kind of media nowadays. I mean, look at video games are a very prime example with things like GTA. You know, in GTA you can go and steal a car and shoot up a street and uh, beat up prostitutes and stuff like that. But are you gonna go out and do that? No. But it's an interesting and I think um, controversial kind of area to go into artistically, and it definitely interests the audience when you do something that is more bold and more out there.
Yeah, I do think shipping, personally, I don't mind shipping. Um, I think it can be a like a good outlet for people to be creative. Um, I know growing up, I wrote fan fiction. Maybe it wasn't like two characters together, but it was like OC plus whoever. Um, but that's still a form of shipping, and I think it's still a form of expression that's not hurting anybody. Um, and I think as long as you can find a space, be it with like one person or a couple people online that have like the same kind of feels, um, as long as you find that safe place, I think it can be a comforting circle community, you know?
Yeah, you're not gonna please everybody. There's always gonna be someone who has an issue with something. Um, even like no matter what you say, you could be like, "Oh, I'm for world peace," and there's always gonna be someone who disagrees with you. It's just inherently, it's in human nature to want to disagree, I think. And so there's no clear way to say if your ship is perfectly 100% okay or not. I think there are definitely lines that you shouldn't cross, and you should be aware of those mentally. And perhaps if you do cross certain lines, make it, make sure you have the appropriate safeguards, such as, the NSFW accounts, where you're making sure that people that might be more impressionable don't get a hand of that and think that that is an appropriate thing to do. That's why we have things like rated M or rated R ratings, so that those people can't get into those genres until they are developed enough to realize that there's a separation.
Yeah. It's definitely murky waters in terms of what the lines are, because everybody has a different line, right? Everybody has different boundaries, everybody has different things that make them uncomfortable. I think generally my opinion would just be that I think that there are certainly some societal lines that most people have kind of established, are things that you don't cross. And I would say that that would be my guideline for the kinds of things that you're going to put out there, simply because typically I think as a society we do have kind of a good grasp on the things that are just a little too far, and hopefully people kind of adhere to those lines.
But also, those are like cultural standards, I think, too. So I think country to country, that definitely.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, going back to like how it's more accepted here to be LGBTQ than it might be in, say, Japan. And that's just a difference of, cultural upbringing and development and so forth. So
certainly, like that's actually a good point that you bring up, because I can of course only speak from a Western standpoint and like what sorts of morals I know that people in the West are typically raised with. So yeah, I don't want to make it seem like I'm saying that everybody should necessarily live by those standards, but of course from my perspective I'm a little biased because those are the lines that we have drawn. So it's really hard for me to separate myself.
Yeah, well,
from
I only bring that up because when I was in college, one of my roommates was, and in fact, eventually two of my roommates were from Jordan, and which is located in the Middle East. And so their viewpoints on a lot of things differed greatly from mine. Now, the one roommate, he was more accepting. He didn't really care about stuff like that and all that. But the other roommate, he was less,
conservative,
I guess,
maybe.
Yeah, he would be more what you would see as like a American Republican kind of viewpoints on like stuff, where he's more conservative. He's not very liberal agenda type.
Yeah.
But so it's interesting to see those viewpoints, and it's like, well, that's how they were brought up. I mean, the one was more, he was over in Jordan, but he had a lot of experience coming over to America for school and such, that he was more socially aware of what we think as Westerners, rather than the other one was more of the upbringing of Middle East and what they felt.
Right. Yeah. And again, like I think what I more specifically meant was things like pedophilia, and things of that nature. Certainly, especially when you're getting into sexual things, there are definitely lots of things that are frowned upon, like vor and whatnot. So it gets
For sure. I mean,
I think
ships
that
are.
I think there are lines like that I'm talking about more societally. We've kind of established, okay, maybe stay away from that. Not so much other things, but definitely it's something to consider.
Yeah, ships are not inherently bad,
No.
and unless you tread across the taboo subjects and take it too far, you know? Um, it's what you make it
Yeah, there's a
that
healthy
makes it.
medium for everything and everybody. And I think making sure that you are aware of that, making sure what others, what they are comfortable with, and so when you do become more open and talk about things that you're comfortable with, making sure that the other person is also comfortable at that level is definitely a
Hmm.
good thing. But again, ships, uh, every series has, you're going to have someone pairing a non-canon couple. I do it from time to time. Though I more so insert myself into the MC's shoes and make myself feel more like I'm that MC and kind of root for the MC to get with the person that I'm interested with. Um, but I can definitely see like where non-canon couples are coming from.
Yeah, I think
Exactly.
most ships are innocent for sure. Most ships are
Yeah,
innocent. Most are fine and wholesome and healthy, and it's
It's a
great.
fun
So
time.
it's just the
yeah,
It
the
creates
I
new
love a
few
good
content.
ship.
the few vocal minorities, I guess.
Yeah, which
Yeah,
definitely
for
always
sure.
sucks because those few are always the loudest that drown out the rest. Um, and hopefully it won't be like that one day, but no promises.
Mm-hmm. So going off of more taboo subjects, I think now is a more appropriate time to talk about lollies. So before we get into it, I just want to state to everybody listening that we are not lolicons. We are not a part of the community um, that are interested in lollies at all. We're outsiders, kind of looking in and taking our stance. So just keep that in mind. Also, we're lumping in uh, lolicons with shotacons and lollies and shotas together. So um, we'll be talking about lollies, but what we really mean is both lollies and shotas because they're essentially, from what we can gather, the same thing, just a different
Mhm.
gender.
Title.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess so. I'll talk about the Webster's definition, and then I'll go over uh what both of us or how. So I'm more.
You can present.
I'll
Yeah.
present the two podcast definitions that we have come up with. So Webster's definition is in Vladimir Nabokov 1955 novel Lolita. The character Lolita is a child who is sexually victimized by the book's author. The word Lolita has, however, strayed from the original referent and has settled into the language as a term we define as a precocisional seductive girl. This definition is based on a considerable body of evidence of the word as it is used in published English prose. So essentially, what that means is Lolita is the as a word of a whole is sexualizing underage girls, and the term lolly comes from that Lolita, or lolly is more of, and then lolicon is more of a shortened version of Lolita complex, which describes someone who is interested in Lolitas. So, for our definitions, after researching on our own and kind of coming in together and figuring out what we wanted to define as our own personal definitions, My personal definition was the sexualized or non-sexualized fictional character that is short and appears more childlike. Danielle and Emily's definition, however, differs slightly, with Lolis are young, prepubescent, childlike female characters, or male in our case as well, if we're talking about shotas, that are often depicted in an erotic, cute manner. So,
Right.
do you guys want to start, or should I go over why I feel that about my definition?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you want to go ahead and talk about it, that's okay.
Sure.
You can
So,
start.
definitely taking more of a gray area with mine, with being leaning more towards the pro. I see Lollies definitely from more of an artistic creativity, where it's okay to have those kinds of characters that appear more childlike, maybe, associating the age with an older. Obviously, you can have the lollies that are in their 40s, you have the lollies that are like 500 years old or whatever, but essentially the character design doesn't differ too much. It's more of a shorter character where you're taking either a sexual standpoint or a non-sexual standpoint. Personally, I don't feel comfortable with the sexualization of them. I think even if they appear older, I don't 100% feel comfortable with sexualizing those characters. I am, however, totally fine with the non-sexualized version, where it is more of a cutesy character, almost mascot-like, I would say. And I think that was a big issue when we were talking about this earlier, is perhaps I was being misconstrued as being for sexualizing of lolly characters, which I'm definitely not. If you guys want to kind
Yeah,
of talk about your
yeah,
points.
that so for sure. So like Dom said, I am definitely against lollies, particularly the sexualization of them. Like Dom said, like I don't really have a problem with just a childlike character existing in a show. That's not a problem at all. I think that the issue for me comes in when they are sexualized either by the creator or by the fans. That is where I definitely take a stance against it and
Mm-hmm.
have a problem with it. Um, and I think that unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it leans more toward the sexual nature, in my opinion.
Yeah, going off of what Emily said, I've most of the time, every time I've seen a lolly, it has been in she has been depicted, or Shota, he has been depicted in a sexual manner that it's not even sexual from the standpoint of like someone else their age. It's more from someone our age or even older, that it's kind of concerning that someone would look at someone significantly younger than them in that manner. That does not sit well with me at all.
And that might be perhaps why you guys have more of an issue with lolly and shota characters than I do. Because when I've seen them in media, it's more of in like manga and such. I've seen, because I want to say uh, perhaps more ignorant to it, but before I was researching, for and trying to find it, I didn't see a lot of sexualization of these lolly type characters. I saw more of them being, again, mascot type characters, and I saw them being more as cutesy type characters. That characters where like they would kind of show their love for, but it was more of an innocent love rather than a sexualized romantic love, if that makes sense.
Um, yeah, so I think perhaps that is the case. Like we do have different experiences with it. I would say that typically, and not to speak for the entire community because I have no idea how other people view the term, but I think from what I've seen, a general consensus is definitely like when you bring up lollies, people kind of tend to know what you're talking about and what you're referencing. Um, and I would say that in a lot of cases, most people would think of them sexually, and I think that is because the original term itself comes from a place of sexualizing young girls. So I don't think it's ridiculous to like see that like people kind of know what you're talking about.
Because I think if you wanted to have like a cute young character, I think they definitely could have had a different name for it or a different connotation with it. Like Lolita Complex, Lolicon, that just,
That
automatically I
yeah.
Well,
The term itself, it does derive from it. Like there is no denying that. And people can use it in whatever way that they want. I know that there are some people that do not use it in a sexualized manner, but the original term, there is no denying that it comes from, in Japanese media anyway, it comes from focusing on an attraction to primarily prepubescent girls.
so before I go back into what you guys are saying with the Lolita as a word, I also want to say, like, I think also it might be an issue of there is a very toxic um, vocal uh, minority that are overtly very much more vocal than I think other um, other interest groups, I would say, or I guess fetish groups, whatever you would like to call them, are then. So, like, incest is an issue, but um, I would say that more people would find an issue with lolly characters than incestual characters. And I think a big reason for that is the kind of the way these like vocal people are portraying these characters. It makes more people feel uncomfortable.
Well, it's interesting that you brought that up too, because I think that the people that are interested in lollies generally, and the people that are vocal about them are the people that are sexualizing them, and that is kind of why it has such a connotation to it as well, is because the audience is people with, in my opinion, pedophilic tendencies.
I gotta agree to some extent with that, but I think it's also like I think a bigger issue is if you're considering yourself a lolicon, I think you're essentially very much deep diving into that kind of how would you call that, a fetish or theme, I guess.
Session.
would say it's a fetish.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think you're deep diving into that more so, and then like so like I'm interested in more tomboy characters, or older women characters, but I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm as infatuated as your typical lolicon is about um their interest in that type of theme. And it just goes to show like there's no like tomboy con, there's no such thing, but lolicon it was such a widely like developed genre that it needed its own term for it.
Well, I think to me the difference is that tomboy is and we can talk about this more because Lolita fashion is a thing in Japan, but tomboy is more of a character, like a personality trait, a characteristic, whereas lolicon, I would argue, is the difference between liking children and liking grown women.
Well then,
So
Lolicon
to me,
is
it's like,
Lolicon is the visual aspect, right?
so
We're looking at a child form, like a character, rather than a an adult woman, you know?
yeah, and that's what I'm saying. I think it's the difference between, most men don't have to clarify, I like adult women that are fully developed. And so that's why lolicon, in my opinion, is a term because I personally feel that it is a glamorized term for essentially admitting that you're a pedophile.
so
That's a bold statement, but I'm making it.
So fair enough. Tomboy could be, is more of a characteristic. So let's go with the One-san characters or the older sister character type deal. There is no One-kan though. There's still no One-kan, but Lolicon, it had to they had to make sure that was a difference. And I think that's the issue, is like you were so infatuated with this kind of underage character type that you had to make a whole another word for having a complex over underage characters.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you see that with pedophilia here today. They don't call themselves pedophiles, they call themselves MAPs, minorly attracted people, you know? It just
Right.
because you give yourself a different name doesn't mean that that's not what you're into. That's not how you think. You're just putting a new title over the same old thing.
Yeah. Um, and to add on to that, I think that an argument that is often made is that they're characters, they're not real. And while to some extent I agree with that, certainly liking a fictional character is slightly different than liking a real life person. Um, and you can't actually harm a fictional character. But what concerns me is the connotation behind it. If you're attracted to characters that look like minors, then you must also be attracted to people in real life that look like minors. And I can say that from experience. I mean, I simp over grown men that embody my type. Um, and, from that, you're not going to assume that I'm a lesbian, probably, or you're not going to assume that I like children because I have a type that I like in anime and that I find attractive. So to me, it's not a stretch to say that people that are sexualizing uh, minors in fiction are not also sexualizing them in real life. I think that those two things absolutely go hand in hand.
Yeah. So
I think they're definitely open. Like, I would think that they would be open to the idea of looking at an actual child in that sense. I'm not saying that they are, because, like, I don't obviously know unless they do something or they tell me. But I can't say that it doesn't make me judge or, like, think that way
Yeah,
about that person.
obviously you could never know what someone's doing in their own house. I'm just saying that my assessment of the situation is definitely that it's a concerning behavior that I
Yeah.
think could develop into a potentially serious real life issue.
So I think where my concern would be is between liking lolly characters and be considering yourself a lolicon. I think liking lolly characters is not inherently bad. I think that you can like them for being cutesy, kind of mascotty type characters, almost like liking a kitten. Um,
Right.
but I think once you consider yourself a lolicon and start calling yourself as such, I think there's a big issue with you're trying to cover up the fact that you are interested in this kind of underage character more than you perhaps should be.
Definitely.
I agree
And
with that.
I think in a lot, I mean, there are cases where lolis or shotas exist as just that's what they are. They're an older character, but they represent cute characteristics. Or in High School Host Club, Honey Senpai is a good example of that. And from my experience, I haven't seen him sexualized, but obviously, if he were to be sexualized, that then becomes a problem of the person doing it.
Yeah.
Not so much the creator for creating a character that is just cute.
Yeah. So again, you have, that separation of the creator, the audience, and the character. So the character can be made, but depending on what the creator does with the character, could make it inherently bad. And at the same time, what the audience makes of the character could also be inherently bad. And it's very much that blurry line where, you got to make sure you stay on, your side, and that you make sure that you're clearly defined, that you're not going past that line.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that oftentimes fans and creators both try to kind of work around those lines by suggesting, like, oh, the character is 40 years old, but they look like they're 8 years old. Or like the
Or they're
character is
100
8 years
years old.
Yeah, or something like that. Yeah,
in
or
an
the
8-year-old's
opposite
body.
could be true. Or the opposite could be true, where a character, their age is, like 8 years old, but they look 40. And I think Dom has more of a with the latter, and I with the former. But either way, I think it's still problematic, because they're not just coming out and saying this is an 8-year-old child that looks like an 8-year-old child and we're going to sexualize them. Because if they did that, then they're admitting that this is pedophilia. But if they say no, it's okay, the character is actually 50, then they can sort of get away with it a little bit more.
Yeah, so for me, I think that's definitely, from an artistic standpoint, it's a gray line whether the person is using it for artistic creativity or are they using it for their own worldly pleasures.
Yeah, well, again, like, I think if you're sexualizing, because this is in terms of sexualizing the character, if you're a creator sexualizing the character, it doesn't, I don't care if it's for artistic creativity's sake. I think you're a weirdo, to be honest.
I don't care if you're making your paint artwork of two characters. It is still depicting a sexual relationship that should not be.
Well, again, that goes back to kind of, there's paintings that hang in museums that are, we know of being an underage girl, and it's a nude painting or a more sexualized painting, but do we draw the line of it being an artistic work and, influencing a whole genre of art and something that we should take from a historical standpoint, or should we take it off because it is essentially child pornography, but we are putting it on a pedestal as art? And that's it's a big topic to cover, and it's one that even museums that curate this stuff are having a hard time trying to figure out. And a lot of that has to do with the growing culture of these things being inherently wrong, and then people growing up, knowing that, no, this is a historical thing. We didn't see it as, a underage person, but, at the same time, now it's out there. Now so should you do something with that information?
I mean, I would argue that it's more than anything, it's an awareness, and it's being exposed for what it is now, more than ever, because pedophilia has always existed. But I think that as a society, we're now, starting to educate people. So exactly, it's like things, even, when my grandparents were growing up, were swept under the rug, and people would deny it, and things, you know what I mean, like, pretend it wasn't there.
You also can't get away from it now. is the thing. Is like with the evolution of the internet is like that your past comes back to haunt you, and a lot of people get canceled and stuff like that. So you can't. It's hard to bury those kind of topics.
But well, and I
I
think
don't
that's a
think
good
we
thing.
should. Yeah, I don't
Yeah, I
think we
think it's a
should
good
bury the
thing.
topics. I think we should always have this open discourse about hard topics. I mean,
No, but I'm
this is
saying,
not a comfortable conversation.
yeah, no, I'm saying like it before. It was hard. It was harder to get that information out. Now it's so widely accessible. I mean, our phones do so much, and that's in the palm of your hand everywhere you go. So it's definitely easier to educate people on these topics, um, and because of that, we started to see that change, and that's why these topics are coming up so more frequently now than they used to.
Hmm.
But
And I mean, the inverse of that too is that these things are becoming way more widely accessible, and so the people that are seeking to do, um, you know, quite frankly, disgusting activities, they're going to find a way to do it pretty easily, honestly. And there are a lot of loopholes that they can get around.
mhm.
Yeah, because the accessibility of having, you know, research and topics, it's it's nice, but you can't change someone's mind. Whether like you can't force them to read it and, say this is bad, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that is bad."
Mhm.
It's unfortunately doesn't happen like that, and it's it's heavy.
Yeah, you can't change a person. You can only hope that um they look over all of the information and come to a reasonable conclusion on that, because they can only change themselves. But so closing up, I wanted to go back to the word Lolita, to kind of a little bit more of a less taboo subject and more of a more like interesting standpoint as the Lolita fashion, where it has that word of Lolita, um, but it is fashion inspired by historical Victorian dolls, which started in Japan and has since gained popularity across Asia and parts of Western world, such as Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States, starting in the 1980s and 90s. Um, which is more of like these kind of frilly, lacy, almost princess like dresses, that look like these Victorian dolls. Uh, and it's interesting because they're not overtly sexualized. I think 9 times out of 10, you'll definitely find the fully covered Lolita style dress rather than a sexualized version. But it's just interesting that they decided to keep the Lolita as the term, even though it's not sexualized underage girls.
Yeah, well, I think where that comes from is that they're sort of reminiscent of
Childlike.
a childlike appearance. Yeah, like some maybe a child that you would see in the Victorian era. So I think that that's where that comes from. And then obviously, and just like anything, there are some people that sexualize it, some people that don't. Um, but I do think that the general term probably just comes from the fact that they are kind of reminiscent of like a childlike appearance.
Hmm.
There are some aspects certainly in the way that they dress.
Mhm.
Just figured I'd
Especially
brought
since
that
we
up.
talked about that there are subgenres, which is gonna happen.
Yeah. Um, but I figured that was an interesting kind of like endpoint, um, where it's just a little bit weird and kind of an outlier in the whole lolicon community, where it's a thing and nobody really cares about it, because it's innocent enough. But it's there.
I definitely would like to hear our listeners' um thoughts on the topics today. I mean, I understand if nobody's comfortable talking about it, but if there are people that do want to talk about it, our DMs are always open. We have our Discord where we can talk about our discussion topics. Because we obviously have our own solid stance on the topic, but it's a loaded question. It's a loaded topic. And
yeah, there's a lot to discuss for sure. But I do like that Danielle brought up the Discord. I think if you're not comfortable with the public YouTube comment section, certainly you can come discuss anything that we talked about today on our Discord.
Yeah, and I think that these are definitely good topics to cover. However, they are definitely very uncomfortable topics. I think we definitely all felt a little bit out of our zone. But
there definitely was some arguments beforehand. So
if we sound emotionally
myself.
drained, that is the
Because we
reason.
are.
We physically were
Yeah.
talking about this for like, I think probably a good 2 hours.
Episode's worth.
An hour.
Yeah,
And
hour,
over an
2
hour,
hours. Somewhere between that range on these topics beforehand, so we weren't overtly like just at each other's throats with this, and we made sure that we knew where everybody was coming from on these topics.
There may have been some slight yelling, some speaking over each other in the conversation beforehand, but certainly
we'll
I
be
think
back for another episode.
Yeah, I think this
We're
was
not
more
breaking up.
productive, and hopefully everybody enjoyed it. So
thank you guys for joining us today for drinks, and I hope you are not too emotionally scarred from this episode, and hopefully we can come back the next episode for a more cheery topic. But this has been the Otakus After Dark podcast. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Discord with Otakus After Dark, or go find the links in our descriptions. Thank you guys for joining us. Bye.
Bye.
bye.